Hey, it's Jeff Hansen. I hope you enjoyed our session yesterday online. This is your video assignment for Wednesday. I recommend that you open the worksheet and enter answers in Microsoft Word as you do this, or if you want, you can just print it out, and then you can work with a pen and paper if you want. Whether your answer is correct or incorrect doesn't matter. You get full credit because the whole point of this exercise is for you to practice answering exam questions now, rather than waiting until you're doing it during the exam. If you can pull the answers out of your brain, it is really going to be good for you. Once you've tried to answer every question in the worksheet, hopefully as you work through the video, it should be uploaded before Wednesday night. Otherwise, you will lose a point per day for not turning it in. And as you go through this, please do not hesitate to phone me for help. Just as life is built on simple monomeric building blocks, which are then assembled into higher order polymers, which are assembled into higher order tissues, which are assembled all the way up into societies, so biochemical nomenclature is built out of smaller monomeric building blocks, which are basically the syllables you learned in understanding organic chemistry. So, the easiest way to be ready for this biochemistry course is to review your organic. If you struggled in organic chemistry last year, don't hesitate to call me to try to help understand how to interpret it. Just as you can use organic chemistry to interpret biochemistry, the organic nomenclature itself is not a question of pure memorization, but it's also a question of interpretation. So again, anytime you get stuck, I welcome a phone call. It turns out that for me, evenings and weekends are actually better since I work mostly during the day. But you can try and phone anytime, and I absolutely want to be sure to hear from every one of you sometime during this course, preferentially within the first week. Now, if it turns out you already understand organic chemistry and you're strong in it, well, great, relax and enjoy a relatively simple review. So now, on your worksheet, please do this matching before you advance to any more slides. If you don't get them all, it's okay, but take a stab and see if you can get them all. Every one of these organic terms I will be using over and over and over in talking about biochemistry. I'm going to go on and now and answer this matching, but before I do it, do your best to match everything up, so I have a feel for what level of organic knowledge you're working from before we advance further in the classroom. But I'm going to go ahead. So a hydroxyl group has a hydrogen and an oxygen, or you call it an alcohol, and the only one of those I see is over here. Hydroxyl, il means linked to. So K, sulfhydryl. Sulfhydryl is just like a hydroxyl, but it has a sulfur, a hydrogen, and it's linked to. So that would be, if you look, sulfhydryl, hydroxyl. Aldehyde, you need to know the difference between aldehydes and ketones, do you? Both aldehydes and ketones have a carbon-oxygen double bond called a carbonyl, carbon linked to. In a ketone, there are carbon atoms adjacent to the carbonyl carbon on both sides. In contrast, in an aldehyde, there's only a carbon atom on one side of the double bond, which means there's going to be a hydrogen atom also adjacent to the carbonyl carbon, the carbon linked doubly to the oxygen. A carboxylate has carbon and oxygen, and it actually has two oxygen atoms. The 8 means that it is the conjugate base of a carboxylic acid. So a carboxylic acid is a proton donor. Once it donates the proton, it is called a carboxylate. An amine simply means you have a nitrogen atom in it, and that would be over here. Now we have a nitrogen atom here also, but it's adjacent to a carbonyl carbon, which is a different character than a lone nitrogen. Amide means you have a nitrogen atom, and "ide," kind of like "ide," "ite," "ate," implies oxidized, so it is a nitrogen next to a carbonyl. An ester bond, like an amide, has a carbonyl, carbon-oxygen double bond, and next to it is a linking oxygen. Just as in an amide, nitrogen-oxygen, there's a linking nitrogen. So amides and esters are quite similar, as is a thiol ester. What does thio mean? Thio means sulfur. So a thiol ester is just like an ester, except instead of a linking oxygen, it has a linking sulfur adjacent to the carbonyl oxygen-carbon double bond. Methane is a single carbon compound, CH4. Methyl means methyl linked to. So there's only one of these compounds that has a single methyl group. It's linked here to oxygen. By the way, can you name the functional group in compound B? I didn't ask it here, but it's called an ether, to have a carbon chain linked through an oxygen to another carbon, or carbon chain, in this case a methyl group. And phenyl means a benzene ring, a phenyl ring linked to some carbon. The various interpretations I use to describe these, I kind of put in writing here to help you understand it. You can take a look and see if that helps. For example, if we look at this compound which has a hydroxyl group or an alcohol group, ethanol, eth2 ane carbon atoms, all alcohol. In alcohol, a name you're pretty familiar with, hopefully not too familiar, the all part I color purple to represent the hydrogen blue, oxygen red. And there's a lot of alcohol groups or hydroxyl groups on all sorts of biochemically important molecules. And again, I'm trying to remind you with color coding how parallel an alcohol is to a thiol, where thi means sulfur in many biochemical terms, and you can look through the rest of this and see if that helps you. Apart from simple organic names of functional groups like amines and ketones and carboxylic acids, you're going to repeatedly come across enzyme names, disease names, pharmaceutical names that have a prefix such as a Greek letter or Arabic numerals or both. You can absolutely memorize 3-beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase deficiency, or gamma-glutamyl transferase, or 5-alpha reductase inhibitors. But if you're just arbitrarily memorizing Greek and Arabic numerals without even understanding what they mean, you really are burdening your mind. If you actually understand what the symbols mean, in many cases you can then simply ignore them, or in some cases you'll go, oh, it's important to know that. So I now want to look at Greek letters and Arabic numerals. This is a very simple system. It's at about the complexity of grade school arithmetic to understand it. And let's begin by looking at fatty acid nomenclature. I'm always going to use simple representations for organic molecules where every angle, every end, every intersection is a carbon atom. If you see that a carbon atom, such as here, has only 2 bonds to it, you can assume that the remaining 2 bonds are to hydrogen atoms because all carbons actually have 4 bonds. So here's a more full representation of palmitate. Here's a simpler representation. The full representation is just too complicated to make sense of it, so I'll always be using the simplified forms. I want you to tell me how you would number every carbon atom in this compound. You need to pause the video, and I believe you would derive the exact same nomenclature that currently is used. Look at all that carbon. Now, what can I use as a landmark? What makes it different? Please continue. Yeah, well look, these 2 oxygens are very different from all the carbon and hydrogens in this molecule. They are the landmark. So if I were numbering this, I would start at the largest atom, I would start at the landmark, and then I would call the first carbon right at the landmark linked to these oxygens carbon 1. And then I would number to the end of the tail. I believe that you would have invented organic nomenclature the same way as it currently exists. So there should be no problem. And there are a lot of enzymes that have a number in them because they relate to a position in an organic molecule. You don't have to legalistically find these positions, but boy, it sure makes it easier to think. What direction does DNA or RNA polymerization occur? From the 5' to 3' direction. Those are based on carbon numbering nomenclature. What if the landmark is not at the very end of the molecule? Now, how would you number this molecule where the landmark is somewhere in the middle of it? Would you please take a stab at numbering that? And then tell me the rule you would make up. You don't want to start at the landmark, because then you're going to have to somehow backtrack. You're going to go 1 to 12 here and 13 to 15 and who knows what direction here. How do you fix that? How would you make the rule? Please? You simply start at the end, which is closest to the landmark. So I say to someone, you see the mountain over there? There's a little hill next to it. That's where you start. So the number 1 rule, Arabic numeral nomenclature, find the largest atom as a landmark, go to the end of the carbon chain that's closest to the landmark and start numbering there. And I'm hoping you're saying this is too simple, and I'm okay with that. I hope that every time I talk with you, you think that I'm being too simple. Not too afraid that that'll happen. How about taking another stab at this? Will you number the carbon atoms in this molecule? Where do you start? Where do you end? And you go, wait a minute, there's a problem. The largest atoms are the oxygen atoms, and they're at both ends. So which end do I start at? Please answer. Well, if you have identical ends, you have a mountain on each side, you need to find the next largest landmark, which is an amine. So which end do you start at? The end closest to the amine. So you start at the end of the molecule that's closest to most of the biggest atoms, so that you would number it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And by the way, I hope you know what this compound is. Please tell me. Yeah, it's glutamate. And if you learn anything from me, you're going to know what glutamate is. There's another system of numbering that's based upon Greek letters. And again, you see Greek letters in a lot of the terms I'll be using throughout the year. You don't have to legalistically know, but the rules are as simple as Arabic numerals. In Greek letter nomenclature, it's based upon the presence of a carbonyl carbon. Do you know what a carbonyl is? A carbonyl simply means you have a carbon-oxygen double bond. So here's a carbonyl. And in Greek nomenclature, the alpha carbon is a carbon that's adjacent to a carbonyl or bonded to a carbonyl. Will you go ahead and use the Greek alphabet to label this molecule? Go ahead and do that. You label the adjacent carbon alpha, beta, gamma. What do you call the carbon that's in the carbonyl bond? You don't call it alpha, you call it the carbonyl carbon. You could go ahead and label each of these. Again, just alpha, beta, gamma going away from a carbonyl carbon. Here I'm showing the Greek numbering of these different compounds. If you're going to use the Arabic numbering here, which direction do you go? Where do you start? And you say, well, let's see. There's an oxygen that's near this end and an oxygen near this end. How can you choose? Well, this largest landmark is linked twice. Therefore, this is the heavier end. It's in a double bond. So you begin 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Let's do an experiment here. For the amino acid, will you label all of the carbons using Greek lettering? And for the acid, will you label just the 2 end carbons at each end using Greek letters? Please go ahead and take a stab at that. But I'm going to move on. Well, again, we do have two carbonyls, so I could call this an alpha carbon and I could call this an alpha carbon. But this is one continuous carbon chain. It'd be nice if I just chose one of them. How would I choose? Basically, I use the same approach I used for the Arabic numerals. I will call this a carbonyl and this a carbonyl. Adjacent to the carbonyl near more big atoms, I will call this the alpha carbon. So we have an alpha amino acid glutamate. So we have alpha, beta, gamma. And you'll notice again, alpha corresponds to carbon 2, because this would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. How about numbering here? Well, again, the alpha carbon is not the carbonyl carbon, it's adjacent to it. Although the carbonyl carbon will be called 1, the alpha carbon is adjacent to it, so this is the alpha carbon and the beta. What about at this end? Boy, I'm not that good at the Greek alphabet. Let's see. Alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon, phi, I don't know. And since us scientists are not so good with the Greek alphabet, they don't label it all the way to the end. You know what they call the beginning and the end? The alpha and the omega. So in fact, alpha, beta, omega 1, omega 2. And in fact, this particular fatty acid would be called, let's see, omega 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. This would be called an omega 9 fatty acid. It is desaturated starting at the 9th carbon from the omega end of the amino acid. It also turns out to be a very important fatty acid called oleic acid. Guess why it's called oleic? What does that sound like? The word oil comes from this because it's found in olive oil. It's the most prevalent fatty acid in olive oil. If you're able to number carbon atoms in organic molecules, and if you have some idea of the various organic functional groups, I hope you move on to part 2 of this fundamental biochemical nomenclature talk. Thank you.